Thank you very much, Fernando, for the great introduction. Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to present you today our last result published at the end of 2017 on the EU climate and energy policy assessment. Here is my presentation summary. So after a quick introduction of the political context and study objectives, I will provide you our analysis on the different possible outcomes that we're discussing during last year's Trilogue EU negotiation on the EU ETS reform that concluded to a deal on November 2017. We have looked into details of the different implications from the Parliament and the Council proposition that we're debating during the year. Thus, in the second part, I will share with you findings on possible evolutions of the EU ETS in the period post-2020. We explore two possible futures, the Brexit, where UK might leave the EU ETS post-2020, and the EU price corridor that will set a floor and ceiling price on carbon from 2020. So the EU is currently revising its 2030 climate and energy framework. On the EU ETS for the emission trading scheme, they reached an agreement at the end of 2017 after months of trial negotiation between the Parliament, Council, and the European Commission. On the effort sharing regulation, an agreement between the EU institutions was also reached at the end of 2017. And other legislative pieces are also under negotiation right now with the clean energy package, including 8 legislative proposals on energy efficiency, renewable energy sources, the organization of power markets, and the governance of the energy union. EU 2030 and 2050 climate targets should now reflect this increased ambition, and they should be translated into the EU climate and energy policies to put the EU in line with the Climate Paris Agreement goals. The Energy Union Strategy, also called the Energy Union Package, or the Energy Union Framework, published in February 2015, set out 5 dimensions to focus on: decarbonization of the energy efficiency, energy security, the integrated internal energy market, and research, innovation, and competitiveness. To pursue these goals within the current long-term strategy, the EU has formulated targets to 2020, 2030, and visions to 2050. On the energy efficiency, the objectives for 2030 corresponds to a decrease of at least 30% both in terms of primary and final energy consumption compared to the same reference scenario. For renewable energy and energy efficiency, the 2030 targets are also currently being negotiated. This study that I want to share with you today aims providing quantitative assessment of the emission trading scheme reform propositions and of the other possible evolution of the EU ETS during its phase 4 from 2021 to 2030, with also a view on long-term perspective until 2040. We also take into account the implementation of other pieces of the EU climate and energy package. The analysis considers 5 scenarios. 3 of them represent the possible outcomes of the trial and negotiation of last year on the EU ETS reform. The first scenario was a Parliament proposition taking into account the different key propositions on the EU ETS reform on market stability reserves and other linear reduction factors. Then the second scenario is a Council scenario, taking into account the different propositions for the Council to the EU ETS reform. The third scenario is based on the Parliament scenario, where there was a proposition of an increase of the linear reduction factor of the cap by 2024. And in the second part of the presentation, I will explore the 2 possible future scenarios on the Brexit case, simulating the implication of an exit of UK from the EU ETS post-2020, and a scenario with the EU price corridor starting from 2020. The study and modeling results are part of a research program called COPEC2 that is led by the Institute for Climate Economic in collaboration with Enerdata and the Institute of Petroleum, French Institute of Petroleum, that we started in April 2017, and the research program will finish in June 2018. What I present you today has been published in last October in the first report called Last Call before the doors close on the negotiation for the post-2020 reform. The second report is expected to be published soon. At least a policy brief will be published in the following weeks during March. In this second report, we are looking more at the policy alignment between greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy and energy efficiency policies, and on the impact of renewable energy and energy efficiency increase of ambition. So before going to the scenarios and analysis of the results, I want to resume here the 5 scenarios that is presented here today. There is, of course, no policy scenario that we define as a counterfactual scenario on which no targets on greenhouse gas emission, renewable energy, or energy efficiency is enforced. And there we drive the different scenarios. On the first one, the Parliament propositions, where the EU ETS sectors has a linear reduction factors of 2.2%. And the intake rate of the market stability reserves is about 24% until 2021. And the rules on cancellation of allowances in the market stability reserve is proposed on one shot only in 2021, removing 800 million tons of CO2 from the reserve volume. On the other policies and instruments, we have implemented the effort sharing regulation for the non-ETS sectors. For the renewable energy target and energy efficiency target, we took the 27% for renewable energy target by 2030 and 30% for the energy efficiency target by 2030. Then we have the concealed scenarios on which we implement the main variant from the Parliament proposition, which is the extension of the intake rate of the market stability reserve of 24% until 2023, instead of 2021, and where they proposed a cancellation approach, which is very different from the Parliament, where the cancellation of allowance in the market stability reserve starts in 2023, and the total amount of allowance in the reserve exceeding the previous year auctions volume are removed. Then we have the linear reduction factor plus scenario, which takes into account the proposition for the Parliament and the option of increasing the linear reduction factors of the cap after 2024 from 2.2% to 2.4%. The two last scenarios are the two possible futures that may happen after 2020, which is the Brexit and the price corridor. These two scenarios take into account the Parliament proposition on the EU ETS reform. And from the Brexit, we remove the Brexit from the EU ETS from the beginning of phase 4. So for that, we had to adjust the cap for the rest of the EU ETS countries involved in the EU ETS. And for the price corridor, we propose to use a recommendation from the report of Confin-Grandjean-Mestrel mission report in 2016. For the modeling approach, we use the post-global energy model, which is a peer-reviewed model jointly used and developed by Enerdata, Grenoble University, and CEVI Joint Research Center of the European Commission. For more information about the model, you can look on the following link later on. So let's move to the first section of this presentation. The EU Emission Trading Scheme and the effort sharing regulation are the EU two major instruments to control and to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. The global EU objective is a reduction of 40% of its greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels. The mitigation effort is thus distributed over these two instruments. The EU ETS, which covers about 45% of greenhouse gas emissions, has a reduction target of 43% compared to 2005 levels by 2030, and it covers large-scale facilities in power sector and industry sectors. And the emission effort sharing regulation covering the rest of the EU greenhouse gas emission has a reduction target of 30% compared to 2005 levels by 2030, and sectors under the ESR on transport, building, agriculture, waste, and small industrial facilities. In our modeling approach using pulse models, the ETS sector is fully covered sector by sector. However, only building and transport sectors are modeled for the effort sharing regulation. Current low EU allowance prices do not reflect the long-term greenhouse gas target. A number of economic and political factors have led to a significant surplus of ETS allowances, creating an imbalance of supply and demand and depressed carbon prices. We can see on the top right figure the EU allowance spot price over phase 3 that stay in a range of 4 to 8 euro per ton of CO2 that does not provide the correct price incentive to influence investment to less carbon-intensive technologies. The 2030 greenhouse gas target is in line with the low end of EU long-term climate ambition. The question is thus how to manage the reconciliation between long-term EU ETS perspective and its functioning during its phase 4. The figure on the bottom shows the EU emissions trend since 1990 that follows the 2020 trajectory in average, with a significant trend change for 2010. The mitigation trajectory from 2020 to 2030 objectives represented by the yellow line fall short compared to the ambition 2050 vision goals of 90 to 95% reductions. We also need an impacting EU ETS reform package. Another decade of low prices would undermine the EU ETS credibility and might lead to the implementation of national policies. As currently proposed by the Commission, the EU ETS reform for its phase 4 will not lead to an efficient carbon price by 2030. Based on the latest political development, the scenario of post-2020 EU ETS design were modeled with both. We say the Parliament scenario, the linear reduction factor plus, increasing the linear reduction factor of the cap from 2.2 to 2.4% from 2024. The Council scenario representing the two major elements of the Council general approach on the market stability reserve with a doubling of its intake rate until the end of 2023, and on the cancellation of allowance approach in the MSR from 2024. The amount of allowances placed in the MSR that is exceeding the number of allowances auctioned the previous year is cancelled. For all the scenarios, we have kept the same assumption and modeling approaches for the period of time. All scenarios are modeled with force until 2040, and the design parameters of the EU ETS are kept constant after 2030 in the different scenarios. On other climate and energy policies, all scenarios take into account the target of the EU 2020 and 2030 climate and energy packages. The EU 2030 targets for energy efficiency and renewable energy are defined as proposed in the Clean Energy for All European package of the European Commission in November 2016, and the effort sharing regulation for 2021 to 2030 is based on the Commission's proposal of July 2016. Surplus of the allowances in the ETS is considered to be available and tradable between actors to comply with the EU ETS constraints, with a 5-year vision ahead marginal cost. This 5-year vision would allow actors to define their cost-effective development strategies. This assumption is quite important. We chose a 5-year instead of another amount of time from discussion with companies under the ETS scheme as a good compromise between a pure myopia of actors in the investment decision and a full anticipation to 2030 or 2050 of the carbon budget that does not make sense in the reality. For the EU ETS, we included aviation till 2020, but give the intensity after that, we only covered the fixed installation for phase 4, 5. The Parliament, Council, and the linear factor reduction factor scenarios lead to similar emission reduction during the phase 4. The different design parameters have no impact on the 2030 target. The different ETS design in the 3 scenarios have an impact on the ETS emission reduction required to achieve the target after 2030. This is what we see in the left figure, where 2.8 gigatons of CO2 in blue of cumulative emissions have been reduced in the three scenarios compared to the counterfactual scenario, no policy, where no target on greenhouse gas, renewable energy, and energy efficiency are forced by 2020 and 2030. After 2030, the modification of the market stability reserve parameters in the Council scenario leads to slightly higher CO2 reduction than in the Parliament scenario in phase 5. The increase of the linear reduction factor has more significant impact with +5 emission reduction compared to the Parliament scenario, around 400 million tons of CO2. That is represented in the same figure on the left by the orange bars. The right figure shows the EU ETS cap represented by the bars and CO2 emission over the years for the three scenarios shown in lines. For comparison with no policy scenario, we plotted it with a dot line. Compared to the counterfactual scenario, without any greenhouse gas emission, renewable energy, and energy efficiency targets, sectors under the EU ETS reduced cumulatively their CO2 emission by around 8 gigatons of CO2 over the period 2017-2040 in the Parliament scenario. More than half of these emission reductions are achieved in the power sector, which corresponds to about 4.6 gigatons of CO2 avoided. The figure on the left shows the emission trajectory for the different ETS sectors, the cap in dashed line, and the resulting allocated allowances in green lines that takes into account the effect of the market stability reserve. The power sectors contributes again to half of the additional abatement effort required in the concealed and the linear reduction factor plus scenarios compared to the Parliament scenario, respectively 4 million tons of CO2 and 200 million tons of CO2. As seen in the previous slide, this additional emission reduction between the scenarios will only appear after 2030. In this slide, we are looking at the implication of the different ETS design on the resulting marginal abatement cost that satisfies the carbon budget. It is important to understand that the curves plotted in this graph are not the ETS market prices, but they represent the marginal abatement cost needed to achieve the emission reduction imposed by the carbon budget constraint defined by the ETS. In phase 4 of the EU ETS, greenhouse gas emission reductions are notably driven by renewable energy and energy efficiency targets and policies. These targets and policies will be sufficient to respect the EU ETS carbon budget. The EU ETS carbon budget, which is defined by the supply of ETS allowances and the amount of allowances in circulation, taking into account the action of the market stability reserve. The carbon value, representing the cost of the emission reduction required to respect the EU ETS target, is thus equal to 0 over the phase 4. From 2033, in the Parliament and Council scenario, and 2032 in the linear reduction factor plus scenario, further reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are needed to achieve the EU ETS target. The carbon values that increase drastically. In the Council scenario, from 2039, the carbon value is higher than in the Parliament scenario. Indeed, the cancellation of a higher number of allowances in the market stability reserve empties the reserves early by 2044, which reduces the carbon budget perceived by market participants within a 5-year vision. With a perfect anticipation of the EU ETS long-term target, the need for further greenhouse gas emission reduction appears from today, and the carbon value rises progressively during the phase 4. The modeling of a 2016-2050 carbon budget shows that the long-term EU ETS target is achievable with a sustainable and politicable acceptable decarbonization pathway. All this, of course, if all actors are correctly anticipated over the full period. The current trajectory of the EU ETS is aligned on the low end of long-term climate ambition, and still represent a drastic decrease in emissions, more than 80% decrease in 2050 compared to 2013. This trajectory needs to be anticipated to make sure the necessary investments are done in a timely manner. Currently, the surplus and the achievement of 2020 ETS target hide this long-term perspective, and there is no visibility on the period beyond 2030. The role of the MSR will be crucial in helping stakeholders anticipate the future scarcity of allowance, but attention should be paid on its environmental integrity on the long run. In spite of doubling of its withdrawal rate in the first year of its functioning, until 2021 in the Parliament and 2023 in the Council, the Market Stability Reserve is not able to counterbalance the effect of the complementary policies on the EU ETS while absorbing the historical surplus of allowances. The scarcity of allowances is only restored by the end of phase 4. However, the Market Stability Reserve may have a psychological effect on the anticipation of the EU ETS operators. Even with the Market Stability Reserve not in force yet, we see this operator anticipation on today's ETS market prices that reached for the first time since many years a symbolic level of €10 a ton of CO2. Allowances held in the Market Stability Reserve may jeopardize the long-term environmental integrity of the EU ETS. On the left side of this, you have the evolution of the Market Stability stocks, and on the right side of this slide, you have the EU ETS surplus. In the Parliament scenario, by 2040, there are still more than 2.6 billion of allowances in the Market Stability Reserve. The Market Stability Reserve will continue to release allowances until the second half of the century, taking into account that 8 million tons of CO2 has been cancelled in 2021. As in order of magnitude, realizing 100 million of allowances in 2050 would correspond to a 27% increase in the EU ETS cap. In the Council scenario, in 2040 there are 360 million of allowances in the Market Stability Reserve. The reserve would be empty much early in 2044. In total, more than 3 billion of allowances are cancelled, with the Council proposition on cancellation of allowances in Market Stability Reserve. And 2.7 billion will be cancelled in 2024. In the linear reduction factor plus scenarios, the increase of the linear reduction factors to 2.4% from 2024 accelerates the reduction of surplus. The Market Stability Reserve releases allowances from 2036, 2 years early than the Parliament scenario. In 2040, there are still more than 2.3 billion of allowances in the Market Stability Reserve, which could keep releasing allowances also very long, over a long time. The key finding of this first part of the study can be resumed as follows. The EU Parliament and Council ETS reform proposals are expected to have limited impact on the short term for the EU ETS development in phase 4. However, neither the Council proposal, neither the Parliament, even with an increase of the linear reduction factors of the cap to 2.4% in 2024, leads to an efficient EU ETS during its phase 4, despite the implementation of the Market Stability Reserve, of course. But it won't bring the need of marginal abandonment cost to satisfy the carbon budget of the ETS. Indeed, in phase 4, greenhouse gas emission reductions, notably coming from the energy efficiency and renewable energy target and policies, are sufficient to respect the EU ETS target, and thus EU ETS is not a driver of the abandonment. The increase of the EU allowance price in phase 4 will be conditioned on the anticipation by stakeholders on the future scarcity of allowances. Over its phase 4, from the early 2030s, further emission reductions are needed to achieve the EU ETS long-term target, and cost of decarbonization increase drastically. In the long term, the EU ETS requires a drastic decrease of greenhouse gas emissions, even though its current trajectory is aligned with the low end of the long-term EU climate ambition. The cost of amendments required to respect the EU ETS target, taking into account the constraints set by the cap and the surplus on the market, become extremely significant in the early 2030s. With a perfect anticipation of the EU ETS long-term target, the need for further greenhouse gas emission reduction will appear from today and will result in a sustainable and politically acceptable decarbonization pathway. Finally, the market stability reserve is not sufficient to mitigate the effect of the renewable energy and energy efficiency policies on the EU ETS, and is only able to restore the scarcity of allowances by the end of phase 4. It may have only an impact on ETS operators' anticipation. With the Parliament proposal, even with an increase of linear reduction factors in 2024, there are still more than 2 billion allowances in market stability reserve by 2040, which could consequently release allowances until the second half of the century, jeopardizing the environmental integrity of the EU ETS in the long run. Attention should be paid to its environmental integrity in the long run. With the Council proposal, more than 3 billion of allowances are cancelled in total, much better, and the MSA will be empty early. But this cancellation approach would be better for a shorter effect on time scale, and will only appear to have an efficient application in the market running on the long term. With the Council in phase 4, the EU allowances price will thus not be driven by a physical constraint on emission reduction, but by the speed of stabilization of the surplus by the market stability reserve and by the anticipation of the stakeholders on the future scarcity of allowances. Reducing the myopia of EU ETS stakeholders beyond 2030 is necessary for an efficient carbon price to appear from today and make the decarbonization sustainable. In this context, an updated 2050 EU roadmap will give more visibility to all. Let's move to the second part of this presentation and exploring two possible future evolutions of the EU ETS. We first go to the Brexit scenarios. The Brexit has uncertainty to the current situations. We don't know if the Brexit will exit the EU ETS, when, how would the transition be organized, which the definition of the cap will be. So in our scenario, the UK is considered to be no longer part of the EU ETS from the beginning of phase 4. All modeling parameters are kept constant in the Brexit scenario compared to the Parliament scenarios for the market stability reserve design, the energy efficiency, renewable energy objectives. The ambition of the EU ETS is assumed to remain similar as with the current emission reduction target. So we ex-ante define, calculate the cap that will be affected the ETS countries excluded UK participation. So the 2020 cap for the EU ETS corresponds to 23.6% reduction compared to 2005 levels, and the 2030 target reduction for the 3% compared to 2005 level is applied to the rest of the EU ETS. Both values give the amount by which the cap is annually reduced for the EU ETS without the UK. So this slide shows the ETS surplus evolution for the Brexit and baseline scenario on the left and the market stability reserve volumes on the right. The new EU ETS cap defined in the Brexit scenario corresponds to higher mitigation efforts for the rest of the EU ETS. Indeed, greenhouse gas emissions covered by the EU ETS in the UK have decreased more than the average of the EU ETS the last years. The surplus is thus resolved faster, and in 2022, the higher threshold of the market stability reserve is reached 3 years sooner than in the Parliament scenario. The lower threshold of the market stability reserve is reached in 2035, and it starts releasing allowances in 2036, 2 years sooner than in the Parliament scenario. Complementary climate and energy policies are the same as in the Parliament scenario and have the same effect on the demand for allowances. Further emission reduction to respect the EU ETS target are required at the same time as in the Parliament scenario in 2033. In the couple of years before the market stability reserve starts releasing allowances, the constraint set by the EU ETS is slightly higher in the Brexit scenarios, and the resulting carbon value is higher. However, as the market stability reserves start releasing allowances sooner in the Brexit scenario, and as the increase of the EU ETS supply by 100 million tons of CO2 is more significant in smaller markets, the constraints set by the EU ETS become less stringent than in the Parliament scenario from 2036. From this date, the carbon value is lower in the Brexit scenario and reach around 300 euro tons of CO2 by 2040 instead of 400. As a consequence of the early release of allowances from the market stability reserve and a lower carbon value than in the Parliament scenario, emissions are higher in the Brexit scenario than in the baseline in 2040 for the rest of the EU. In total, around 100 million tons of CO2 are additionally emitted until 2040 for the rest of the EU. The majority of those additional emissions come from the industry, about 55%. The key findings are summarized in this slide. The new ETS emission cap defined in the Brexit scenario corresponds to higher mitigation effort for the rest of the EU ETS. As a consequence, the Brexit impacts the decrease of the surplus and the market stability reserve functioning. Indeed, the surplus will be resolved faster than in the Parliament scenario in 2022. The higher threshold of the market stability reserve is reached 3 years sooner than in Parliament scenario. As the market stability reserve starts releasing allowances sooner in the Brexit scenario, and as the increase of the EU ETS supply by 100 million tons of CO2 has a more significant impact in the smaller market, the constraints set by the EU ETS become less stringent than in the Parliament scenario. ETS emissions in the Brexit scenario are 4% higher than in the baseline scenario in 2040. The results of the Brexit scenario cannot be dissociated from the assumptions that we made in this scenario for the adjustment of the EU ETS parameters. So in case of the UK leave the EU ETS, careful consideration should be taken on several ETS parameters like cap adjustment methodology and on the market stability reserve design, threshold, and release of allowance life. So another possible future evolution of the ETS could be the implementation of the EU carbon price to create a short-term significant carbon price incentive that is expected to decarbonize the energy. The idea has been raised by several experts, reports, and has also been spoken by some governments. In this study, we proposed to implement one of the recommendations of the Conference Ministerial Emission Report of 2016, where a price corridor has been proposed with starting value of floor price at 25 euro a ton of CO2 in 2020 and a selling price at 50 euro. This both price increasing by 7% annually over time. So this is what is plotted on the figure in this graph. In our modeling approach, we have created an additional reserve to store the auctions that should be cancelled until the carbon budget would generate a marginal abandonment cost equal to the floor price. This scenario does not model a price-based market stability reserve. The market stability reserve is still functioning as it is designed today in the ETS reform. So to be simple, if the carbon budget imposed by the ETS is too weak, auctions will be cancelled and moved to the corridor price reserve until a stringent carbon budget that generates a marginal cost equal to the floor price. If the carbon budget becomes too stringent, meaning that the resulting marginal abandonment cost will be higher than the selling price, then we will move back to the market allowances that is stored in the price corridor reserve until the marginal abandonment cost satisfying this carbon budget is at the selling price. The figures on this slide show on the right the annual free allowances and auction allowances, and also represent the annual flow for the cancelled auctions that move to the market stability reserve in the green and to the price corridor reserve in the yellow. Dashed line represents the planned cap trajectory. On the left, we plot the resulting carbon value for the price corridor scenarios and compare it to the baseline scenarios. So with the joint action of the Market Stability Reserve and the Price Corridor Reserve, all auctions are cancelled in 2020. And only 30% of planned auctions take place in 2021. So there is a huge change of auctionings in the two first years. The surplus is then resolved very quickly in only 2 years' time, and the Market Stability Reserve starts releasing allowances in 2022, while the Price Corridor Reserve keeps absorbing allowances until 2035. The carbon value, so the marginal cost needed to satisfy these carbon budget constraints with the functioning of this new reserve, stay at the carbon floor until 2035, and then increases to the carbon selling price by 2037. So is represented with a yellow line. I don't know if you can see it very clearly on the slide. That stay at the floor price at the beginning until 2035, then move 2 years to the selling price. If we look at the surplus evolution plotted with lines in this figure for the corridor price scenario and compared to the baseline scenario, we see that the surplus is very quickly absorbed in only 2 years' time. The corridor price reserve makes the ETS functioning and enhance mitigation action for the ETS sectors. The colored area in the figure represents the volume of the reserve. Price corridor reserves in yellow reach 4 billion of allowances by 2035. On the contrary, in the MSR, which started releasing allowances in 2022, there are only around 280 million allowances in 2040, so much less than what we have shown in the previous scenarios for the EU ETS Trilogue negotiation. By 2040, the price corridor reserve has not started yet to release allowances, which will happen in early 2040s. The scale of allowance exchanges between the Market Stability Reserve and the Price Corridor Reserve would thus be much smaller if we consider the cancellation methodology proposed by the Council that remove about 3 gigatons of CO2 over the period. The implementation of a price corridor leads to early mitigation action in the EU ETS sectors and reduces cumulatively emissions by around 30% more than in the baseline scenario. More than half of this additional non-emission reduction are achieved in the power sector. The drastic increase in the carbon value in the Parliament scenario bridges the gap between the emissions in the two scenarios by the end of phase 5. Price corridor scenario key findings are that the implementation of a carbon price corridor leads to the transfer of a significant number of allowances in the dedicated reserve. In 2020, due to the joint effect of the price corridor reserve and the market stability reserve, all actions are cancelled. In 2040, there are 4 billion of allowances in the price corridor reserve. The surplus is very quickly absorbed in only 2 years. The market stability reserve starts releasing allowances in 2022 and is almost empty by 2040. From 2022 to 2035, the two reserves have opposite actions. The price corridor reserve absorbs allowances while the market stability reserves release allowances. Attention should be paid on the articulation of these two reserves. Interaction will be different and thus much smaller if the cancellation methodology proposed by the Council is implemented, for what has been decided and agreed from the Trilogue negotiations. With the implementation of the price corridor, the carbon value stays at the carbon floor until 2035 and then increase to the carbon ceiling, which is reached in 2037. So the carbon value, in this case of price corridor scenarios, will reach around 50 euro a ton of CO2 in 2030 to 200 euro a ton of CO2 by 2040. The implementation of a carbon price corridor leads to early mitigation actions in EU ETS until 2040. The implementation of the price corridor would be a way to counterbalance the myopia of stakeholders. However, the question remains, what would be the consequences of a later release on the market of the allowances contained in the price corridor reserve? I will then conclude this presentation with 2 slides highlighting the recent development and challenges that the EU climate and energy policy framework is facing. On November 2017, a deal has been reached from the trial negotiation on the EU ETS reform, and EU member states formally approved on last Tuesday the post-2020 EU ETS reforms. This deal is, on the one hand, a success. It includes the most ambitious components of the Council proposition on the increase of intake rates of the market stability reserve till 2023, and on the cancellation approach of allowances, which is much stringent than the Parliament and European Commission positions. And on the other hand, as shown in this study, this EU ETS design reform might not have the expected short-term impact to stimulate a significant and coherent carbon price incentive to support the energy transition. It may have a limited impact over the phase 4. The market stability reserve is not sufficient to mitigate the effect of renewable energy and energy efficiency on EU ETS, and the cancellation would only influence the market on the long term, but also might jeopardize the environmental integrity of the EU climate long-term goal. So even with this first good EU policy state on the EU ETS reform, EU climate target and policy fall short in the long-term climate action. Counterproductive intervention undermine the energy and climate policy efficiency, and the agreed reform on the EU ETS will not be sufficient to get overlapping effect of other policies on the EU ETS. We have brought here a way in this presentation so the implementation of carbon price corridor scenarios from 2020, allowing the increase of ambition while making the EU ETS functioning and encouraging decarbonization. Other solutions could be found to the governance of the energy union negotiation by setting up an efficient policy alignment framework to properly account for policy interaction while providing flexibility of increasing ambition on greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy, and energy efficiency targets. So on these second options, we have realized the last month some scenarios and analysis that are part of the research program COPEC 2, and the second report will be published soon, but it was expecting to be published a little early, but we have a little delay. And in this report, we provided an ex-post and ex-ante analysis of interaction between EU energy and climate policies, and we propose policy options on how to better align policies, mitigate interaction, and to meet the long-term EU climate ambitions in line with the Paris Agreement. I would like to thank you all for your attention. I hope I have not been too long with too many informations, and I will stay ready to answer your question right now or later by email.